Have you ever worked really hard on a project and then you turned around and all of a sudden it's like it had just disappeared? It was almost as if you had never actually been there and never worked on that project. Do you know how you feel? Well, you might be able to relate to the Old Testament character of Nehemiah, whose story we are going to wrap up today. Stay tuned.
If your desire is to become spiritually stronger, emotionally healthier, and relationally smarter, you're at the right place. Speaker and writer Stephanie Smith inspires and equips you to achieve these three key aims. If you're a parent, you also learn how to raise empowered kids, ready for adulthood. Let's get started.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm delighted that you are here. And can you believe it? We are finally going to wrap up the Old Testament book of Nehemiah. I never anticipated when we started this series that so many episodes would be devoted to this book. It is a rich book, and it's also just a good reminder for us that no matter how familiar we are with a biblical story or book or passage or character, there's always more that we can learn if we will dig in. If you've been tracking along with us, then you know that the walls of Jerusalem have been reconstructed, they have been dedicated. And now, as we get to the final chapter, we're hoping to read kind of a story of, and they lived happily ever after. Unfortunately, that's not what we come across. You know, in stories and movies, the after the conclusion, not the very end, but after the main plot has been wrapped up, then what follows after that is what is known as the denouement. And so this last chapter is kind of the denouement of the whole book of Nehemiah. And in movies and in stories, we love it when all of a sudden all the pieces come together and everybody, gets to be with whoever they're supposed to be with, or, the bad people have been eliminated or had justice meted out or whatever it is. We don't like when the story ends and there's like this cliffhanger, or the people that we want to see punished just get off, and the people who should be rewarded are the ones who are not. And it's like, wait, what? We sat through this whole story so you would give us that? Well, it's not exactly what happens in this last chapter of Nehemiah, but it's kind of close. But there are important life lessons that we absolutely can and need to learn from this book. Well, what happens is that after Nehemiah has been governor of Judah for 12 years, remember he had taken basically a leave of absence from his work as serving King Artaxerxes. At that time, the greatest ruling power on the planet, the Persian Empire, and he takes this leave of absence that the king approves to go back to oversee the rebuilding of Jerusalem, literally and metaphorically. And after 12 years, he returns to serve in the palace. We don't know exactly how long he served there before he comes back to Jerusalem a second time. And I think this is kind of interesting because, as you read through the book of Nehemiah, he's a pretty exact writer. He gives a lot of numbers, he gives years, he gives dates, he really dives into a lot of the details and throughout the whole book. And yet he does not do that when he talks about returning the second time to Jerusalem. I have no idea why that is. It's just what happened. So he's gone for, we don't know. We don't know whether it was 2 years or 10 years or 20 years. We just don't really know. But what happens is when he comes back to Judah and to Jerusalem, things are not to his liking. And why? Because the people have turned away from following through on all the promises that they made about how they were going to be faithful to God. If you remember, after the walls are reconstructed, people not only get together and make this verbal commitment, but they have a written commandment that the leaders of their tribes all sign. I mean, this is a legal it's the equivalent of a legally binding contract. They have taken this incredibly seriously. And even though they weren't obligated to put their commitment in a written form, it was part of their effort to demonstrate to God and to themselves and to future generations how serious they were about keeping God's commands and loving and serving Him. But something has gone awry. So, some of the things when Nehemiah comes back to Judah that he finds are a large room in the temple that had been designated and set aside to hold sacred items that were to be used in worship to God have been moved, and it's been turned into living quarters for Tobiah, who, if you recall, was somebody who was Jerusalem's enemy. He was somebody who had taunted and had tried to frustrate, and who had even gone so far as to threaten military force to stop the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. Why in the world then does he have a living quarters in the temple? Well, it goes back to this. It goes back to power. He was a wealthy and powerful man, and through marriage, he had established a relationship with Eliashib, a priest. Now, because Eliashib is a fairly common name, we don't know if this was the Eliashib who was actually the high priest, which would make all of this even worse, or if he was more of a regular. But either way, Eliashib knows that what he is doing is profaning God's temple, and he is exalting a human being and saying, "You're more important than worship to our God." If you're the leader of an organization, whether it's a church, it's a school, it's a business, it's a ministry, it doesn't matter what it is, a political leader, don't underestimate the power plays and the positioning that people will place themselves in and who they will align themselves with, ultimately looking out for themselves. The priest role was to be an intercessor, an intermediary between the God and the people. And he totally walks away from that. And instead, what he wants to do is he's just looking out for himself here. He wants to be aligned with a person of power and wealth rather than being a person who is dependent on and in service to the King of Kings, which is God. Nehemiah is not very happy when he returns and finds this out. As a matter of fact, what he does is he kind of goes on a bit of a demolishing. And so he goes into this living quarters and he takes all of the Tobiah's furnishings and everything, and he just throws them out. I don't think there was a yard sale. I think it was just more of a just throw these out and who cares what happens to them. This is a righteous indignation. This isn't a temper tantrum from somebody who's jealous. This is somebody who fully understands. This is more than, oh, we just kind of, got rid of the golden lampstands and instead, we brought in some sofas and chairs instead. This isn't about furnishings. This is about obedience to God. The other thing that he finds is that the Levites, the priests, they have all returned to their villages. And the reason for this is because their salaries were supposed to be paid according to the tithes and the offerings that people would bring in. And people had been set up to administer this, to oversee this. There were literal physical places that had been designated where the tithes and offerings would be brought in. All of that had been done. The structure was in place for all of this to happen. But people hadn't done their part. Having a structure is necessary, but it's never enough. You cannot depend on structures to accomplish your mission. This is one of the mistakes that we see the organizations make, especially as they become larger or they are around for a longer period of time, is they begin to put more reliance on and prioritize their structures, their policies, than they do their people. You have to have both. They needed the structures in place so that there was some way that the tithes and offerings would actually be counted, collected, and distributed. They had to have that structure. So they had that. But they also had to have people in place who would make sure that those structures happened so that they would serve their purpose, their ultimate purpose. Well, that had all just kind of gone by the wayside. And so the Levites are left saying, well, you know what? We have to be able to eat, and people aren't bringing in their tithes and offerings, and the leaders of the people are not holding them to account for this. Okay, well, we're going to go back to our farms because we got to have places to live and we got to have food to eat. And this is the way that we're going to have to provide for ourselves. So that's what they had done. The other issue that Nehemiah finds when he comes back is that men had married foreign women. We need to understand this for what it is and what it isn't. This was not racism as we would define it today. It wasn't because God had placed a hierarchy of value according to people's race or their ethnicity. It had nothing to do with that whatsoever. God is the creator of all people. There is no value system that's assigned to people because of their heritage, because of their looks, because of their race or ethnicity or nationality or anything else like that. So it wasn't that God was racist and he was wanting to have a racist people. Rather, it was a recognition that on the whole, when you looked at this and at a categorical level, that when the foreign women came into these marriages, they brought with them their foreign gods and religions, and eventually they would turn people away from following God. We see other stories throughout the Old Testament where there were foreigners who came and married Jewish people, but they came with a different heart. They came with an attitude of, we want to serve your God. And they were totally accepted. And God had made provisions for these people to be able to come in and to join the Jewish people. So this wasn't just about racism. This was about honoring God and keep covenant with him and helping to minimize the temptation, not just for these individuals, but for their children and generations to follow, of turning away from God. Another issue, as if this isn't enough, that Nehemiah confronts is he sees that many of the children aren't even learning Hebrew. Again, this isn't about an ancient language war. This is understanding the impact of this. Number one is their Jewish identity is not being honored. This is not about nationalism. It is about understanding that as God had chosen the Jewish people to say, there are things that I am going to do in your nationality. I am going to send my prophets to you. I am going to send my son as part of your nationality that were distinct from other people. It's not a matter of value. It was just a matter of providing a way for the rest of the world to get to know God and to be able to see the impact and how he would bless people who followed him, whether they were Jewish or not, and the consequences when people did not just at an individual level, but at a national level as well. The other impact of the children not learning Hebrew is they are not going to be able to read God's word for themselves. They would end up in a position of dependency on others to read and interpret it for them, or they would just lose all interest in this. Another issue is that the Sabbath is being profaned because it's just being treated like any other day of the week. Again, we need to have a clarity of understanding about the Old Testament law and when it applied to the Jewish people, when it applied to all people, and when there are laws that we are no longer expected to follow because of the coming of Christ. Again, Jesus said he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. When you have fulfilled something, then you can file it up and you can put it away. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. It just means that its value, it has served its purpose, and now it's on to something new. So we don't look at the commandments the same way now that people would have been expected to have done at the time of Nehemiah. At that time, honoring the Sabbath was an incredibly important commandment. And to detail what did that really actually mean, God had specified that in some kind of excruciating detail throughout some of the Levitical laws that had also come down to people back at the time of Moses. Because if you just said, well, honor the Sabbath, that was pretty open ended. So, what did that actually look like in practice? Well, God let people know about that. Certainly, what had happened over time is people had added to that rather than just keeping it at face value. And by the time of Christ, it had become a tremendous burden on people. And a lot of the customs and things that were not part of the original law that God had given were being used to beat people up if they didn't follow these man made laws. But at the time of Nehemiah, people are just treating the Sabbath like it's any other day. They don't need to have this day where they focus exclusively on God and they accept the humility of being limited as a human being and acknowledge that they are going to have a day of rest. Well, what we see is Nehemiah is pretty angry about these things, and he definitely takes action to have corrections made. And part of this reads a little bit more like Jesus in the temple clearing out the money changers that we read about in the New Testament, which is not typically one of those posters that we put up on children's Sunday school rooms. We typically go more for the posters where Jesus is sitting down and he's gathered children around him and he's holding some little lamb or something. And those have their place, but we never want to lose sight of while that is an accurate picture, it's not the only picture. And Nehemiah takes some pretty drastic action to correct the wrongs that people are engaging in. I think that there are three life principles that we can conclude and as we look at this final chapter and as we look at the entire book of Nehemiah. Two of these are pretty sobering and one is encouraging. The first one that's sobering is that leadership matters. It's not enough to just have people who are in positions because they have, quote, the right credentials. We saw that with Eliashib, the priest. He was credentialed, he was a priest, but he did not have the right heart. It's not enough to just have credentials. You've got to be able to have people who are both skilled and right hearted. It wouldn't have been right to have put somebody who was not a priest in a priestly position, but you needed to have both the credentials, the skills, and the right heart. The second life principle that is sobering for us to see here is that devotion to God is not just passed from one generation to another by default. One of the things that you've heard me say before on this podcast is maturity isn't independence. It's when we own our interdependence. When we own the reality that our choices, the impact of our choices extend beyond ourselves. And honestly, this is something that non-Western cultures tend to get more than we in Western cultures tend to really practice and believe and live in alignment with that truth. It's not the immediacy of impact that determines whether something is right or wrong, good or bad, healthy or unhealthy. We see that in our physical bodies. There might be something that I could ingest that I would need an emergency trip to the hospital for. But there are other things that people can ingest in their bodies over long periods of time. I mean, maybe decades before the impact of that shows up in a way physically that necessitates some sort of treatment or shows up as a very limiting condition. Most people don't fall over dead the first time they smoke a cigarette, but you smoke enough of those over a long enough period of time, and eventually your body is going to show the signs of that. It will have an impact. And sometimes we look at sin or decisions that we make in that way of measuring, well, okay, but what's the impact? Do we see the impact? And that's very much an arrogant way to live. Oh, well, if I do this, am I going to experience some immediate impact? That's a very self-centered way to live. And this is one of the reasons that God has graciously given us his word and he's given us truth, because it's not the test of whether we experience in a very short period of time the impact of our decisions that makes something right or wrong. We have this objective information that tells us whether something is right or wrong, good or bad, and we choose to live aligned with it or not. One of the things that we read that the people had recognized earlier, and when Nehemiah was there in Judah serving his first term as governor and rebuilding Jerusalem's walls, they had recounted to God their history, not just their individual history, but their history as a people. And we talked about one of the reasons they did that is because they were admitting to themselves, and they were also saying, God, we get it. We understand that the impact of our decisions will go past us. We might not even experience the full impact of our decisions. That might not show up for generations to come. And so, because we understand this, we're going to commit ourselves to doing what's right. And yet, here we are. Some years later, and have the people followed through on this? Well, certainly there were people that had remained faithful at an individual level, but you also had plenty of people who had not remained faithful at an individual level, and most of those were actually people in positions of leadership. And this is something that we really want to align ourselves with this truth. Just because I don't experience the impact of my decisions immediately doesn't mean there's not going to be an impact. All impact doesn't show up the same way that if I decide I'm going to defy gravity, it's going to have a pretty immediate impact. And I'm going to find out pretty soon, oh, I guess that whole thing about gravity is actually true. Most of what we experience in life actually does not happen on that kind of a timetable. It happens on a much slower timetable. And the reality is, I might make decisions that the full effect of that, I don't actually even feel. It might be my children, my grandchildren. And when we look at that as at a corporate level, we see that in terms of nations and people groups as well. So Nehemiah isn't just coming back here and setting things right just because he wants things to be right in his lifetime. He deals with some things that on the face of it might kind of seem like, what's the big deal, Nehemiah? I mean, aren't you kind of overreacting here a little bit? But what he understands is it's not just about these people, it's about their children and their grandchildren and the generations to come. But in spite of all of that, that's actually kind of discouraging when we come to that last chapter, there's also something tremendously encouraging that we can see in this. Nehemiah stays on track. Isn't it great to see that every leader does not have to blow up their life? They don't have to blow up their ministries. It is possible to remain faithful to God over the course of someone's life or for a very long period of time and not just blow everything up. Nehemiah has the opportunity to wield his power as Judah's governor and leader, either during his first or second time living there. And yet, what do we see? We see somebody who does not abuse his power. It is absolutely possible to be in a position of power and not take advantage of people. And what we also see with him is that age does not equal lethargy. It's not like he comes back to Judah the second time and says, "Hey, you know what? I have put in my years. I have done my time. I was here before. I invested in you all. You guys have all decided that you want to do your own thing and you don't want to follow God. Okay, fine. You know what? Have at it. Good luck. I'm going on with my life, or I'm going back to the palace and I'm going to serve there, and you guys are all on your own." He doesn't allow cynicism or fatigue to just make him check out and say, "That's it. I've done my time. I'm out of here." He stays invested over the long haul. He remains full of zeal for God. He remains in a place of power that he uses to benefit and serve others. And it's also interesting that he says 3 different times in this final chapter something that we really haven't seen him repeat nearly like this at all through the remainder of the book, through the previous 12 chapters. And in different ways, 3 times in this chapter, he says, "Remember me, oh my God, for good," or something close to that. Why does he say this? Well, he doesn't exactly detail for it. This is exactly why I said this. So I want to be careful that I don't impart motives to him that he hasn't recorded. So this is a little bit more of kind of a guess rather than, hey, this is exactly why he's doing this. I wonder if for one reason is because it's a way of asking God for his help and that the work that he's doing will outlive him. You know, in the Old Testament book of Genesis, when Joseph is in prison and he asks the butler to remember me when the butler gets to go back to his job serving Pharaoh, Joseph isn't saying, "Hey, I just want you to file away a recollection of me." No, no, no. What he's doing is he's saying, "Hey, I want your help. So when you get out of here, remember me and then do something about it. Help me to get out of here." And so I don't think Nehemiah here is just saying, "Hey, God, I just kind of want you to remember me." Only, I think it is also that he's saying, "God, I want you to remember this work here, and then continue to make this work succeed. Don't let it just fall apart as if I was never here." The other thing, I think we could just kind of take this at face value, and then he's wanting God to remember his service. Now, we might be tempted to go, "Oh, well, that seems like a little egotistical to me." I don't think so. You see, humility is not the absence of desire. And there's nothing wrong with asking God to remember our devotion. Remember, one of the things that God tells us in the New Testament is that we must believe not only that he exists, but that he is a rewarder of those who serve him and who seek him. So Nehemiah here, we don't know exactly how old he is at this point. And maybe as he's looking towards the end of his life, or maybe it's just the end of his time here in Judah, where he's wanting his life to count. He's wanting it to extend beyond himself, not just in human form, but for who it counts most, and that is for God. We don't know exactly what happens to Nehemiah. We don't know if he remains in Judah for the rest of his life and then he passes away there. We don't know if he returns to serve the rest of his days in the courts of Persia. We don't know. He just kind of disappears from history for us. So we're just kind of left with this closing chapter of his book. But what we can see is the tremendous impact this man had in Jerusalem, in Judah, in the nation of Israel's history, and the life lessons that he demonstrates for us as leaders of ourselves, first of all, And then whether we step into leadership positions in business or in ministry in any capacity. A life of devotion to God, whether it's individually or as a people group, never happens by default. It only happens if we have consistent intentionality. At every age, we don't get to a certain point. We're like, okay, I put in my time. I'm good now. And it's also independent of any previous success. When Nehemiah comes back, he doesn't say, hey, last time I was here, I did all this really great stuff. Okay, I'm good now. I can just kind of, float along with that. That is not what life is about. And we can choose to align ourselves with that truth or not. And what we can also learn from the book of Nehemiah is it's not just going to be us that's impacted by the decisions that we make. We never really know how far our impact will go. And hey, that just reminds me, if you're not already a subscriber to the high impact newsletter that I put out every week that arrives in your email inbox, then you need to hop over to the website, stephaniepresents.com, and sign up for that weekly newsletter. Okay, my friends, Nehemiah has taken us quite a while to walk through. We will be back next Tuesday with a whole nother subject. In the meantime, I want you to remember this. You have an impact that is immeasurable, eternal, and irreplaceable. See you next time.
Thank you for listening. Visit the website, stephaniepresents.com, and sign up for High Impact to join the mission of building spiritually strong, emotionally healthy, and relationally smart women and families. You can also book Stephanie to speak at your event and check out additional resources. Together, we can invite and equip generations to engage fully in God's grand story.